The cameras rolled live across the globe as former U.S. President Donald Trump took the stage at a major international summit held in Geneva. With his signature confidence and trademark red tie, Trump wasted no time in claiming the spotlight. Flanked by his entourage, he stood at the podium and boomed into the microphone. Africa obeys. They always have, and they always will. Power is respect, and we've got both. The audience fell into a stunned silence. Many world leaders glanced at one another, eyebrows raised, but one man sat motionless, unmoved: Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He had been invited as a guest speaker, but his presence alone had become a quiet form of resistance in the room. The camera zoomed in on Traoré's face, stone cold, eyes sharp. He didn't blink. Backstage, whispers turned into murmurs. News anchors started typing, preparing for headlines. But none expected what was about to happen next. After Trump finished his remarks, Traoré was quietly introduced. As he walked to the podium, there was no fanfare, no teleprompter, just silence. And then, "We don't hear dogs," Traoré began calmly, his voice steady, his gaze locked forward, "and we certainly don't obey them." The room froze. No translator spoke. No aide reacted. The statement cut through the air like a blade. He continued, "For centuries, you've barked at our borders, claiming control, pretending dominance. But the leash you once held has snapped, and now, it is you who fears the bite of freedom." Phones buzzed. Social media erupted. #Traoré was already trending within minutes. The world watched, breathless. Some in the room applauded softly. Others sat in shock. Trump, red-faced, leaned back in his chair, gripping the armrests tightly. His smirk faded. This wasn't just a clapback, it was a declaration. And the war of words had only just begun. Within hours of the Geneva Summit, the world was on fire, not with weapons, but with words. Every major network, from CNN to Al Jazeera, led with one headline: Traoré calls out Trump, "We don't hear dogs." The media frenzy was instantaneous. Commentators clashed on live panels. Western analysts tried to spin the statement as disrespect. African voices called it revolutionary. But for the millions watching across the global south, it was something more. It was vindication. Traoré, meanwhile, remained silent after his powerful declaration. He didn't post on social media. He didn't give interviews. He didn't need to. His words had already become gospel. In the streets of Ouagadougou, murals were painted overnight. Traoré's silhouette stood tall beside the words, "We don't hear dogs." Activists held impromptu rallies across West Africa, chanting slogans of sovereignty. Even in Paris, African diaspora groups gathered, holding signs that read, "Colonizers bark, we rise." In Washington, the mood was less celebratory. Trump appeared the next morning on a conservative talk show, trying to brush off the moment. "Look, I wasn't offended. I've been called worse by better," he chuckled, though his clenched fists betrayed him. But then he slipped, as he often did. "He'll regret saying that. Africa doesn't scare us. Never did, never will." It was a veiled threat, but one the world didn't miss. Traoré, when approached by journalists days later, gave only one comment: "Those who bark loudest often bite the least." That line, too, went viral. It was no longer just about geopolitics. This was cultural, psychological, symbolic, a war of dignity, not drones. And in that war, for the first time, Africa had a microphone, and wasn't asking to speak. What began as a defiant exchange between two world figures quickly turned into a global reckoning. The Western echo chamber, once insulated by media control and historical narratives, began to crack under the weight of one unfiltered truth: Africa was no longer silent. Across college campuses in the U.S., debates ignited. Students from African backgrounds challenged professors and pundits who dismissed Traoré's words as uncivil. Protest placards appeared reading, "Silence is complicity. Resistance is dignity." The phrase, "We don't hear dogs," became a trending tattoo among Pan-African activists, a permanent mark of defiance. Meanwhile, in Africa, state-run media that once parroted colonial scripts began shifting tone. Burkina Faso's national broadcaster replayed Traoré's viral response on loop, not as a political statement, but as national pride. Even countries historically aligned with Western powers began to re-evaluate their positions. In private, advisors warned Trump that his careless remark had done real damage. "You've turned Traoré into a global icon," one aide whispered during a closed-door strategy session. "He's not just a soldier now, he's a symbol." But Trump, never one to back down, doubled down. "I've seen symbols fall before. This one's no different," except he was wrong, because this symbol wasn't just Traoré. It was centuries of stolen voices, buried truths, and erased names, all erupting in one perfectly timed response. African youth started using AI to amplify their stories, remixing the infamous clip into music, animation, protest art. The line, "We don't hear dogs," was sampled into rap lyrics and even echoed in a fashion line that sold out within hours. What was once just a quote was now a movement. A reporter from France 24 asked Traoré days later if he would apologize to maintain diplomatic channels. "Apologize," he said, narrowing his eyes, "for choosing to speak instead of bark." The camera cut. The feed went viral. The message was loud, clear, and unforgettable. The air in the UN hall was dense, not just with protocol, but with tension. Traoré stepped forward, not with a diplomatic smile, but with the fire of ancestral defiance. The crowd had expected him to apologize, or at least soften his stance. Instead, he locked eyes with the Western delegation and began. "For centuries," he said, voice unwavering, "you've used fear as a leash. You call it diplomacy, we call it survival." The cameras rolled. The translators hesitated, unsure how to phrase his next line without igniting scandal. "You say fear is power," he paused. "Then why do you tremble when the powerless speak?" Meanwhile, Trump, sitting in his estate in Florida, watched the speech unfold live. He sipped from a golden tumbler and muttered, "That boy talks big. Let's see him walk big." But this wasn't about walking, this was about standing. And Traoré stood taller than ever. Back in Burkina Faso, schools interrupted lessons to broadcast his speech. Elders wept. Young students stood and clapped in classrooms. For the first time, they weren't learning colonial history, they were watching it fracture in real time. In the media echo chambers, Western pundits scrambled. Some called Traoré dangerous. Others labeled him the future. Either way, he could no longer be ignored. And in a cafe in Lagos, a grandmother whispered to her granddaughter, "He speaks like our grandfathers did." Before they were silenced, Traoré finished his address not with a threat, but with a sentence that burned itself into the memory of everyone watching. "We're not afraid of your armies," he said. "We're afraid of forgetting who we are." Then he turned and walked out, not waiting for applause. Because applause wasn't the goal, liberation was. The White House press room buzzed with anticipation. Trump had just finished an impromptu statement outside the South Lawn, turning to cameras with his signature scowl and barking, "Africa obeys. They always have." The clip went viral in minutes. Commentators tried to spin it, staffers tried to walk it back, but the world had already heard it. And so had Traoré. Within hours, the Burkina Faso presidential office released a single line across all platforms. "We don't hear dogs." The message was blunt, raw, intentional. That night, Traoré addressed the African Union via satellite. His voice was calm, but his words hit like thunder. "We are not colonies, we are continents. You don't talk to us. You bark at us, but we don't fetch." In Washington, aides scrambled. Should the U.S. issue a clarification? A denial? A threat? But Traoré didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he flew to Ethiopia, where he met with leaders from across the continent to discuss forming a new economic bloc, free from Western oversight. Cameras captured the moment as he stood before a room full of heads of state and declared, "We don't need permission, we need memory. We were kings before we were slaves." The room erupted in applause. Across global news, debates raged. Was Traoré being reckless or revolutionary? Was he isolating Africa or finally uniting it? Back in the US, Trump tweeted furiously, calling Traoré ungrateful and a disgrace. But the tweet fell flat. In the new information battlefield, insults had lost their sting, and truth traveled faster than fury. Meanwhile, young Africans began posting videos with a simple gesture, pointing to their ears, then shaking their heads. "We don't hear dogs." It had become more than a clapback. It was a movement. And as Traoré returned home, welcomed by crowds in the tens of thousands, one message was clear. Africa wasn't just rising, it had stopped listening. Fox News lit up with commentary. "Traoré is disrespecting a world leader," barked one anchor. "He should show gratitude," snapped another. But Traoré wasn't interested in gratitude to those who only offered chains. When asked by an international journalist whether his words were too provocative, he didn't blink. You don't ask the prey to thank the predator for letting it live longer. The interviewer paused, clearly shaken by the intensity behind the calm voice. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down, appearing at a rally in Ohio where he told the crowd, "We gave Africa everything. And what do we get? A dictator calling me a dog?" The crowd laughed, some barked mockingly into the air. But what Trump didn't realize was that his words were being played in classrooms, community halls, and military bases across Africa, followed immediately by Traoré's response. In Ouagadougou, thousands gathered around outdoor screens watching the exchange like it was a championship game. Children shouted the phrase in unison. "We don't hear dogs." And it didn't stop there. Artists began creating murals of Traoré with his hand cupped to his ear and a bulldog silhouette behind him, its mouth open mid-bark, crossed out with a bold red line. Graffiti across urban walls read, "Our ears are closed. Our minds are open." African musicians sampled Trump's voice and layered it under Traoré's response, creating protest anthems that flooded TikTok and YouTube. In Washington, officials scrambled to manage the PR disaster. The State Department released a generic statement calling for respectful diplomacy between allied nations. But it was too little, too late. The phrase had already transcended headlines. It had become armor. In this battle of words, it wasn't just Trump and Traoré anymore. It was an old empire and a new defiance. And as the sun rose over a continent that had long been underestimated, one thing became certain. Africa had stopped listening, and started speaking. Back in Washington, Trump's media team launched a full-on campaign to spin the narrative. Press releases were issued, pundits were booked, and social media bots flooded platforms with messages painting Traoré as ungrateful, rogue, and a threat to global stability. But every attempt to control the message only made it worse. On African soil, Traoré took the stage during a Pan-African Economic Summit in Accra. The hall was packed, delegates from over 30 nations, journalists from around the world, and, most importantly, millions watching live. With the American embassy representatives sitting stiffly in the front row, Traoré stepped up to the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply looked straight into the camera and said, "Respect is not taught by leashing others. It's earned by unleashing your own dignity." The applause erupted. Delegates stood. Even some U.S. allied ministers hesitated, torn between protocol and admiration. But the real shock came the next day. Dozens of African leaders, from east to west, began quoting Traoré's line in their own public speeches. The phrase, "unleash your dignity," trended globally. And for the first time in decades, African youth weren't just reacting to global power, they were defining it. Trump's inner circle panicked. One advisor suggested calling Traoré personally. Another pushed for economic sanctions. But Trump? He went live again. This time from Mar-a-Lago. "We've been too nice," he shouted. "Maybe it's time Africa remembered who's in charge." The words fell flat. Online, clips of Traoré's calm poise were now being remixed into cinematic reels. Street artists across Nairobi and Lagos painted murals of the summit moment. In one, Traoré stands with arms behind his back, a lion's shadow cast beneath him, and Trump's barking figure fading into smoke. And while the White House scrambled to regain narrative control, Africa had already moved on. They weren't listening to the bark. They were marching to their own roar. The next morning, the world press couldn't get enough of the footage. From BBC to Al Jazeera, Traoré's defiant calm in the face of Trump's insults was replayed across all networks. In cafés in Dakar, bars in Paris, and even dorm rooms in Atlanta, people watched the exchange, again and again. It wasn't just what Traoré said, it was how he said it. In Paris, a French journalist tweeted, "For the first time in a long time, Africa didn't just respond. It led." That post went viral. In the US, political analysts clashed on air. Conservative pundits demanded that Washington remind Traoré of America's influence. But younger voices, especially those in African American communities, began rallying behind Traoré. Memes exploded. One showed Trump with a speech bubble saying, "Obey," and below it, Traoré coolly sipping tea with the caption, "Who's barking again?" But this wasn't just social media noise. In Burkina Faso, Traoré called for a press conference. When asked if he feared U.S. retaliation, he smiled. "If standing tall makes us a target, then let history show we never bowed." He then announced the beginning of a Pan-African resource alliance, independent of Western oversight. Leaders from Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even South Africa signaled interest. For the first time, a unified African minerals bloc looked not only possible, but imminent. Washington was furious. The U.S. Trade Department issued a statement hinting at possible sanctions. Trump doubled down on his rhetoric, calling Traoré a danger to democracy, a line that sparked laughter across much of the global South. Meanwhile, murals of Traoré began appearing across Johannesburg and Kinshasa. He wasn't just a leader anymore. He was becoming a symbol. And the more Trump barked, the more powerful Traoré's silence became. It wasn't submission. It was strategy. It was revolution. As Traoré's speech spread like wildfire, a deeper shift was underway. In Washington, high-level meetings buzzed behind closed doors. Trump, red-faced and pacing, demanded options: military, economic, cyber. "He's a fly on the wall. We can crush him in a day," he roared. But in the intelligence briefing, a general hesitated. "Sir, this isn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. He's lit a match under every colonized memory on the continent." Trump dismissed it as weakness. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré met with regional military leaders. His voice was calm but unflinching. "This is no longer a battle of bullets. It's one of dignity. Let no African soldier stand silent while his people are mocked." In a secret meeting, diplomats from Senegal, Algeria, and even Egypt listened carefully. Some had been cautious of Traoré, too bold, too young, too revolutionary. But now, he was untouchable. His words didn't just echo, they struck chords deep within nations still carrying the scars of colonial chains. In Europe, cracks formed too. French and British ministers issued statements reaffirming friendship with African nations, but citizens were not buying it. Protests erupted in Marseille, with banners reading, "Listen to Traoré." Meanwhile, a leaked email from a U.S. military base in Niger revealed preparations for contingency responses, code for potential military action. Traoré's intelligence agency intercepted the communication. At his next speech, in front of tens of thousands, he stepped to the podium with purpose. "They prepare to strike because they fear our unity. Let them come. We are no longer tribes scattered, we are the storm." The crowd erupted. Drums echoed. Flags waved. What began as a viral moment was now a movement. And across the Atlantic, the White House lights burned through the night, not in celebration, but in dread. Because this time, Africa was not backing down. The dust hadn't even settled from Traoré's last speech when global media erupted. Clips flooded every platform. Headlines read: "The African president who dared to call out the West. Traoré versus Trump, power redefined." Some American commentators mocked him, calling him theatrical, unstable. But others, especially among younger generations and scholars of history, nodded in silent admiration. A voice from Africa had finally spoken without filters, without fear. In classrooms across Johannesburg, teachers replayed his speech. In Accra, children began reciting his lines like scripture. At the UN, things grew tense. The U.S. delegation called for a closed-door emergency session, citing escalating anti-Western rhetoric. But Traoré's delegate responded calmly. Is truth now considered escalation? If so, your silence must be peace. That line went viral within hours. Meanwhile, Traoré stood at the center of a newly emerging coalition. Young African leaders, historians, economists, and artists began forming what they called the Continent's Circle. Their first mission? Rewriting the narrative. No longer would Africa be presented as helpless, needy, or indebted. No longer would its gold, its cobalt, its people, be stripped of agency. Trump, sensing the tides turning, tried to regain footing with a speech from a military base. Don't be fooled. We built the world you live in. But the world was already shifting. A graffiti artist in Nairobi painted a mural of Traoré standing tall beside shattered chains. In bold red, it read, "We hear lions, not barking dogs." Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré sat quietly with his advisors. He wasn't celebrating. He was planning. They've ruled through noise. Now, we speak in clarity. Let them fear our silence, too. Africa was no longer echoing orders, it was issuing declarations. And for the first time in generations, the world had to listen.